You've probably done it dozens of times this week without thinking twice. Grabbed a packet of Tams from the cupboard, maybe dunked one in your morning coffee, felt that little moment of satisfaction. It's such a routine part of being Australian that you'd never question it. But here's something that might make your next Tim Tam taste slightly different. While you're enjoying them without a second thought, overseas regulators have raised questions about the very same biscuits. Not because they're unsafe exactly, but because of something hiding in plain sight on the ingredients list. Something that's perfectly legal here, widely used across our supermarket shelves, yet has prompted serious discussions in other parts of the world. The thing is, most of us have never actually looked at what makes a Tim Tam beyond the chocolate and the cream. And what you're about to discover might change the way you see not just these iconic biscuits, but dozens of other products sitting in your pantry right now. Let's start with what we all know. Tim Tams are arguably Australia's most beloved biscuit. Since 1963, they've been part of our culture, our childhoods, our tea breaks at work. The Tim Tam Slam alone is practically a national ritual. 286 million packets sold every year. That's roughly 11 packets for every single Australian. We export them to over 40 countries. They're in our lunchboxes, our office kitchens, our late-night snack sessions, so when you hear that something about them has raised eyebrows internationally, your first reaction might be confusion. What could possibly be controversial about a chocolate biscuit? The answer lies in a category of ingredients that food manufacturers have relied on for decades. Emulsifiers. Now, before your eyes glaze over at the technical term, stay with me, because this affects nearly everything you eat. Emulsifiers are the ingredients that help oil and water mix together smoothly, that give foods their texture, their shelf life, their consistency. Without them, your chocolate would separate, your ice cream would be grainy, your bread would go stale overnight. They're in thousands of products, and for the most part, they do their job quietly and effectively. Tim Tams contain two specific emulsifiers: soy lecithin, which you'll find listed as 476, and another one called 471. That second number is the interesting one. 471 refers to mono and diglycerides of fatty acids. And here's where things get complicated. In Australia, both of these are approved food additives. The Food Standards Australia-New Zealand, FSANZ, has evaluated them and permitted their use. They meet our safety standards. They're in everything from bread to margarine to chocolate to ice cream. Walk down any supermarket aisle and you'll spot those numbers again and again. But over in Europe and parts of North America, 471 has sparked considerably more debate. Not enough to ban it, mind you. It's still approved for use, but enough to prompt ongoing research and some significant regulatory discussions. Why? Because of emerging questions about how these emulsifiers might interact with our digestive system over time. Specifically, with something you've probably heard about lately, your gut microbiome. Your gut contains trillions of bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms. They're not invaders. They're essential. They help you digest food, produce vitamins, regulate your immune system, even influence your mood. It's an entire ecosystem living inside you. And like any ecosystem, it's sensitive to changes in its environment. Recent research, particularly studies published over the past 5 to 7 years, has started examining what happens when we regularly consume certain emulsifiers. The findings haven't been catastrophic. Nobody's suggesting Tim Tams are poison, but they've been interesting enough to keep scientists digging deeper. Some laboratory studies have shown that when animals are fed diets high in certain emulsifiers, including mono and diglycerides, changes can occur in their gut bacteria. The protective mucus layer that lines the intestine can thin. Inflammation markers can increase. The balance of bacterial species can shift. Again, these are animal studies, conducted under controlled conditions with doses that don't necessarily reflect human consumption. But they've raised questions. Enough questions that researchers are now conducting human trials to see if similar effects occur in people who consume these additives as part of their normal diet. Now, You might be wondering why this matters to you personally. Here's the thing. You're not just eating one Tim Tam. You're eating Tim Tams plus emulsifier-laden bread for breakfast, plus processed cheese at lunch, plus ice cream for dessert, plus dozens of other products throughout the week. The cumulative exposure adds up. And while each individual product meets safety standards, those standards were largely established decades ago, before we understood the complexity of the gut microbiome, and before we were consuming ultra-processed foods at the rate we do now. The average Australian gets around 30 to 40% of their daily energy from ultra-processed foods. That's nearly half of what you eat. And emulsifiers are in most of them. So the question isn't really whether Tim Tams alone are dangerous. The question is whether our overall dietary pattern, heavy in these additives, might be having subtle, long-term effects that we're only beginning to understand. Here's where it gets more complex. Not all emulsifiers are created equal. Soy lecithin, that 476 in Tim Tams, is generally considered one of the gentler options. It comes from soybeans. It's been used for over a century, and the research on it has been mostly reassuring. The 471, the mono and diglycerides, sits in a slightly grayer area, partly because it's a broad category. Mono and diglycerides can be derived from animal fats or vegetable oils, and the source matters. They can be processed in different ways, which affects their chemical structure. So when you see 471 on a label, you're actually looking at a family of related compounds, not one single ingredient. The European Food Safety Authority has reviewed 471 multiple times. They've maintained it's safe for consumption. But they've also noted that more research into long-term effects would be valuable. Some European countries have started encouraging manufacturers to reduce emulsifier use where possible, not because of proven harm, but as a precautionary approach. Meanwhile, in Australia, FSANZ maintains that current evidence supports the safety of approved emulsifiers at the levels we're consuming them. So, who's right? Honestly, both regulatory bodies are working with the same scientific evidence and reaching slightly different conclusions about how cautious to be. It's not that one is ignoring danger and the other is being paranoid. It's that food regulation always involves judgment calls about acceptable risk, especially when you're dealing with emerging science rather than clear-cut hazards. For you as a consumer, this creates a strange position. You're caught between reassurances that everything's fine and a nagging sense that maybe you should pay more attention to these numbers on ingredient lists you've been ignoring. And the truth is, neither extreme panic nor total complacency is probably the right response. Let's talk about what we actually know versus what we're still figuring out. We know that emulsifiers are functional. They serve real purposes in food manufacturing. We know they're approved by regulators worldwide. We know that acute toxicity isn't a concern. You won't eat a Tim Tam and feel immediately ill. We also know that our understanding of gut health has exploded in the past decade and that research is ongoing. We know that some studies suggest potential concerns, while others find no significant effects. We know that individual responses to foods vary enormously based on genetics, existing gut bacteria, overall diet, and lifestyle factors. What we don't know yet is whether decades of cumulative exposure to multiple emulsifiers, combined with other aspects of modern diets and lifestyles, contributes to the rise in inflammatory conditions, digestive issues, and metabolic disorders we're seeing across developed countries. That's the big question researchers are trying to answer now. And it's genuinely difficult to study because you can't easily separate the effects of one ingredient from everything else people are eating and doing. Here's something practical you can do with this information. Look at your overall eating pattern. If Tim Tams are an occasional treat in a diet mostly made up of whole foods cooked at home, the emulsifiers in them are probably not your biggest health concern. If, however, you're reaching for ultra-processed options at most meals, those emulsifier exposures are stacking up alongside other additives, preservatives, and highly refined ingredients. That cumulative load might be worth thinking about. Reading labels becomes more meaningful when you understand what you're looking at. 471, 472, 475, 476. These are all emulsifier codes. If you're seeing them in the first 5 ingredients of most things you buy, that tells you something about your dietary pattern. It doesn't mean you need to eliminate everything containing emulsifiers. That would be nearly impossible and probably unnecessary. But it might mean consciously choosing less processed options more often. The Tim Tam question isn't really about Tim Tams specifically. It's about a broader shift in how we eat. 50 years ago, most of the emulsifiers in our diet came from natural sources. Egg yolks in homemade mayonnaise, for example, which contain lecithin naturally. Today, we're getting them from dozens of manufactured products. Our grandparents weren't eating mono and diglycerides 3 times a day. We are, and we're only now beginning to study what that might mean. One researcher described it this way: we've essentially been running a large-scale experiment on the human gut microbiome without really meaning to. By shifting to ultra-processed diets over the past few decades, we've changed the chemical environment of our digestive systems. And we're only now looking back to ask what that experiment's results might be. This isn't about demonizing food manufacturers. They're using approved ingredients to create products people want to buy. Tim Tams taste good because of food science, because emulsifiers help create that smooth chocolate coating and creamy filling. There's no malicious intent, but there is a gap between regulatory approval based on traditional toxicology and our emerging understanding of how foods affect complex biological systems like the gut microbiome. So what's the takeaway from all this? Tim Tams are legal in Australia because they meet our food safety standards. Those standards are based on scientific assessment. But science evolves. What seemed perfectly safe 20 years ago might look different with 20 more years of research and changing consumption patterns. The questions being raised overseas aren't about banning these biscuits. They're about whether we should be more cautious about cumulative exposure to certain additives as our understanding of gut health deepens. You don't need to throw out your Tim Tams. You don't need to become paranoid about every ingredient number. But you might want to think about balance. If you're eating mostly whole foods and Tim Tams are your once-a-week treat, you're probably fine. If ultra-processed foods dominate your diet, the emulsifiers in them are just one part of a larger pattern worth examining. The fascinating thing about this whole discussion is how it reflects broader tensions in modern food culture. We want convenience and shelf stability and consistent texture. We also want natural and healthy and minimally processed. Often, we want both in the same product, which is essentially impossible. Emulsifiers enable the food industry to deliver convenience. They're why Tim Tams can sit in your cupboard for months without going off. They're why chocolate stays smooth and doesn't separate. They're why you can buy bread on Monday that's still soft on Friday. But convenience comes with trade-offs, and we're only beginning to understand what some of those trade-offs might be. The honest answer to whether Tim Tams are okay to eat is the same as for most foods. It depends on how much you eat, how often, what else you're eating, your individual health status, your gut bacteria composition, and probably a dozen other factors we haven't fully mapped yet. What makes this particularly relevant now is that we're living through a period of significant dietary change. The Australian diet has shifted dramatically in just 2 generations. Your grandparents likely ate far fewer packaged foods, far fewer additives, far more home-cooked meals from basic ingredients. That shift has brought convenience and variety, but it's also changed our collective gut health in ways we're only starting to measure. Inflammatory bowel conditions are rising. Food intolerances seem more common. Metabolic disorders are increasing. Are emulsifiers a contributing factor? Maybe. Probably not the only factor, but possibly part of a complex puzzle that includes sedentary lifestyles, antibiotic use, stress, sleep deprivation, and overall dietary quality. Isolating one ingredient's impact is nearly impossible because we don't eat ingredients in isolation. Here's something most people don't realize. The gut microbiome is incredibly individual. Your bacterial composition is as unique as your fingerprint, which means your response to emulsifiers might be different from your neighbor's. Some people might have gut bacteria that handle these additives without issue. Others might be more sensitive. We don't yet have simple tests to tell you which category you're in. What we do have is the ability to observe our own responses. If you notice digestive discomfort, inflammation, or other symptoms after eating heavily processed foods, That's information worth paying attention to. Your body might be telling you something about your personal tolerance for these additives. Not everyone will notice anything, but some people genuinely feel better when they reduce ultra-processed food intake. The Tams story is really a microcosm of a much larger conversation about food, health, and regulation in the 21st century. We're eating in ways humans have never eaten before. We're consuming ingredients and combinations that didn't exist until recently. And we're learning as we go. Regulators are trying to keep up with emerging science. Researchers are trying to answer incredibly complex questions about how modern diets affect long-term health. And consumers are trying to make informed choices with incomplete information. None of this means you should feel guilty about enjoying a Tim Tam. Food is meant to be enjoyed, not just analyzed. Cultural foods, comfort foods, treats, they all have value beyond their nutritional profile. But it does mean that awareness matters. Understanding that those numbers on the ingredient list represent actual chemical compounds with potential biological effects helps you make more informed decisions about your overall dietary pattern. The question, why are Tim Tams legal in Australia but questioned overseas, doesn't have a simple answer. They're legal because they meet Australian safety standards. They're questioned because science keeps evolving and raising new considerations. Both things can be true simultaneously. Food regulation is always a balancing act between enabling food production and protecting public health, between current evidence and precautionary principles, between what we know for certain and what we suspect might be worth investigating further. Your relationship with Tim Tams, and with ultra-processed foods generally, is ultimately personal. Some people will decide this information doesn't change anything for them. Others might choose to be more selective about when and how often they consume foods heavy in emulsifiers. Neither response is wrong. What matters is making that choice consciously, understanding what you're consuming and why. The reality is that the Australian food supply is generally safe. You're not going to be poisoned by approved additives. But safe doesn't necessarily mean optimal, especially at the consumption levels we've normalized. And as our understanding of nutrition and gut health continues to evolve, the definitions of what we consider safe or optimal will likely continue to shift as well. So next time you reach for that packet of Tim Tams, maybe take a moment to actually look at the ingredient list. Notice those numbers. Understand they represent emulsifiers that serve specific functions, but also interact with your gut in ways we're still studying. And then, make your choice. Enjoy them as an occasional treat in a balanced diet? Absolutely fine. Rely on them and dozens of similar products as dietary staples? Maybe worth reconsidering. The power is in being informed and intentional about what you're putting in your body, day after day, year after year. That's really what this whole investigation comes down to. Not fear, not guilt, but awareness. Understanding that the convenience of modern food comes with ingredients our bodies didn't evolve eating. Recognizing that regulatory approval is based on current science, which is always incomplete and evolving. And making choices that align with your own health values and how you want to feel. Tim Tams aren't the enemy. Ignorance about what we're consistently consuming might be. And now you know a little more about what's actually in that iconic Australian biscuit and why it matters in the bigger picture of how we eat today.